All right, good evening, MACU. Hope everybody is doing well. I want you to open up that Word document that was at the top of the lesson plan for today. Make a copy of that yourself. You can download that, hopefully print it out, and take notes from this lecture for this evening for your class grade. So if you haven't already downloaded the document, go and do that, push pause, go download the document and do that, and then come back to this recording. All right, today I want to talk to you about the era of Reconstruction. This is going to take us from the immediate aftermath of the end of the Civil War up until the early 1890s into what is then called the Gilded Age. But this is several moments of important time in our nation's history. So using your notes there page, I know there's a couple prompts for you to respond to, including, um, what Lincoln's ideas were, which is where we will start. So here's our outline to begin with. And here we go to Lincoln's thoughts about Reconstruction. Now, even before Lincoln's assassination, there had been discussions about what it would be like when certain states were reintroduced into the South. As a matter of fact, there were certain portions of Tennessee, other places that as the war had progressed, that they had been permitted to go through a process by which they would rejoin the federal government. So this discussion had already been going on prior to Lincoln's death, and he had spoken about this, to look out for the widow and the orphan, and that there was going to be sort of a new birth of freedom. But one of the things that was key to that was that the institution of slavery in the United States of America was going to come to an end. Now, exactly how that would play out is going to be a part of the story that we look at today. So these were the two major things that Abraham Lincoln had already spoken of, and it's always sad for me to think about what would have been, what would Lincoln have done with the issue of Reconstruction and enfranchising former slaves into full status as citizens in the United States of America. That kind of reminds us the importance of how one individual responds in a specific situation, like John Booth, acting in a very cruel and murderous way, how that really had a ripple effect for generations to come. There's a verse in the Bible that speaks about how an individual's sins can visit not only their children, but their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, how this can really be a long systemic problem. So our actions should always be intended to be as Christ-like as possible. Of course, very unfortunately, on the night of April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, in a little bit better mood, knowing that Lee has surrendered and that the war is over, decides that evening to go with his wife to Ford's Theater, just around the corner from the White House, in order to have just a little bit of free time. But obviously, unbeknownst to him, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, is lurking and plotting to kill him. Now, there's a lot to the story of John Wilkes Booth that gets overlooked or has been forgotten. But in fact, Booth had been at Lincoln's second inauguration and had stood just on the portico right above him. Later on, his diary is going to show his record of that event and his claim that he should have shot Lincoln while he had the chance. There's a picture of that online that you could go and look at. Now, you can see here that Booth has a knife in his hand. Now, he was a very famous actor. I would compare him maybe, say, to Brad Pitt or someone like that. He was well known in the theater community, and as he lurked around the theater that night, most people were not suspicious at all, because this was a place that he often found himself. And as Lincoln's guest that night, it was supposed to be Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, but with the war just being over, they had decided to leave Washington that Easter weekend to go and visit with some family. And so this other young officer and couple joined the president that night in this special booth at Ford's Theater. Now you'll notice that Booth not only has his pistol, but also his knife that he's intending to stab or kill whoever else might be there. And of course, Booth makes a very famous comment as he jumps from the balcony to the stage, the words of the Virginia flag, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning in Latin, "thus always to tyrants." So, of course, that refers to the Virginia flag, to King George III of England, and you can see a depiction of that flag online. And unfortunately, tragically, Booth's decision to kill Lincoln. He also attempted, there was a plot to kill the Secretary of State, the Vice President, that kind of unraveled. He was the only actor that night, the only figure that night that actually went through with or was able to actually carry out the assassination attempt. There's a really good book called Manhunt, and there's another movie that just came out about the girl that whose boarding house Booth stayed at, has come out recently. You can actually still go to Ford's Theater. You can go to the boarding house where Booth stayed, and as a matter of fact, on the next slide, I have listed two of the important memorials to Abraham Lincoln and his legacy. Of course, the Ford's Theater legacy, you can see there is the link, and then here on this is just the National Park Service Lincoln Memorial. Very famously, the Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural address. The Lincoln Memorial has been for our country sort of an important place to gather when we talk about personal rights and freedoms. And Lincoln has certainly become a central figure in our national history for much good reason. Okay, so these are the two memorials that I mentioned. There are literally thousands, tens of thousands of books that have been written about Lincoln, his growing up years, the politics, the war years, his assassination, any kind of aspects, his legacy, some of the what if books that are there. But certainly, if you ever have a chance to go to Washington, D.C., these are two of the places that you certainly should visit and take some time to learn some more about this most important figure in our nation's history. Now, the guy to the upper right corner, Andrew Johnson, who is the vice president of the time, is suddenly thrust into the role of President of the United States. He's going to be the new leader of the Republican Party, but he is by far the most radical of the Republicans of that time. As a matter of fact, Thaddeus Stevens, some others that are pictured here, are going to push Johnson to go even further in the efforts, not just to call an end to slavery, but also to enfranchise African Americans with the right to vote and other privileges, other basic rights that had been denied them previously. And for a season, there are going to be some great moments of success as these new Republicans, former slaves, take their place in our federal government. Unfortunately, with Reconstruction is going to unravel and it's going to end up eventually in what we today call Jim Crow, the black codes, any sort of laws that leave people short of rights that they certainly are enjoy and are rightful to have today. So these codes, in some part there, are going to limit access to voting, limit employment and education on a local level, limit places that people can live, even stay for the night, eat when they're traveling. There's all kinds of these various Jim Crow or black code laws that are going to come into effect in this era. So the radicals wanted to set up the new governments on the position that they would ban slavery. But immediately there was pushback from the next step, meaning enfranchising the African American community. The radicals, we would call them, wanted to give the right to vote to all loyal to the Union, regardless if they had been a freeman or a slave. All citizens would have, male citizens would have the right to vote. But in fact, there were a lot of folks, even within the Republican Party, that weren't really sure that this was the condition or the right condition for things. And so, in fact, they took away some of these basic rights by installing in state law some of these things that I mentioned, these black codes that led to a segregated society, restricting the rights of freed people. And these restrictions would stay in place for nearly another 100 years. Now, there are some positive responses to the Civil War. There are many that come to the South, sometimes called carpetbaggers, to take advantage of the chaos and the poor economic conditions in the South. But there are others, like the Freedmen's Bureau and the Union League, that are going to try to better the condition of former slaves through education, through employment. But in many ways, we have to give credit to those who were formerly enslaved themselves. Many free men and women that advocated for themselves in the public eye to embrace the laws that were being enacted by Congress. One of those early laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that people had basic rights living in a civilized society. Now, I do have you take a little bit of time in your notes to not only note the date of these amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but also to note their importance: the end of slavery, equal treatment, and the right to access the vote. But I want you to spend a little bit of time right now. You might want to just stop the video and do a little Google search. If we were in class, I'd probably give you 10 minutes right here to do that, where you would go through and familiarize yourself with each of these important amendments. Now remember, we remember the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. It's actually the first 12. We really don't talk about 11 and 12. These are the first amendments to the U.S. Constitution since the founding. The Constitution allows for this, but this shows you how important these amendments really were and are today, especially the 14th Amendment, equal protection, as that has continued to be expanded well beyond just civil rights for former slaves, and continues to shape our court system and also our entire society. So these are important responses to the war, both individually, community-wise, in larger situations with our entire political process. But the reality is Reconstruction is not going to have a long-lasting effect. Now, two separate important things to detail here for just a second are the new labor systems. Though slavery is outlawed, there's going to be many former slaves that become enmeshed in the sharecropping system, in which they rent the land and the tools and the mules or horses from the owners, and then they share the profits with owners. Now, a lot of times these arrangements were very one-sided and didn't really allow for the former slaves to prosper much. There are going to be some few rare exceptions where these things are different, but many African Americans, many former slaves, are going to find their way into northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, where they'll find not only a growing African American scene and community like Harlem in New York, other places in the north. There's going to be certain places that the Great Migration takes many former slaves and their children and grandchildren into the north, where they're going to find their own challenges in the growing city life and the growing urbanization of the late 1800s. Two of the big players as well are going to be the church. The church is going to be, for the black community, the one place where they can go not just to worship, but also just to fellowship, to assemble, to talk about educational goals, to talk about lots of other things. And so in many ways, in the African American community, the church represents a sort of a way of life in a larger sense than other congregations seem to be. So things are changing, and let's continue. All right, so the President Johnson of that time was ultimately impeached by the Congress before him, who wanted Johnson to act in a more what is called radical way. Johnson is kind of pumping the brakes on some of these things. We all have been through, most recently, 2 impeachments of our former president, Donald J. Trump, where the House of Representatives claims that there is a charge, a crime that has been committed. Now, the Constitution says these crimes should be treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, like, a serious malfeasance or a serious problem. The House of Representatives initiates the charge, simple majority vote, and then the matter is turned over to the United States Senate to hold a trial. But in the U.S. Senate, in order for a president or other federal official to be impeached, there has to be a 2/3 majority. So this is a lot higher level mark. It's not just a simple majority that is often all that is needed in the House of Representatives for any legislative action, but also the Senate serves as sort of a cooling mechanism. So in Johnson's case, his offense was over the hiring and firing of cabinet officials, whether the president, the executive branch, has the right to do that. Eventually, in the Senate, he is not found guilty of some high crime or misdemeanor. And so he remains in office, but his time in office is relatively uneventful. And that is until the time of Ulysses S. Grant. So Ulysses S. Grant will take office in 1868, the war hero. He becomes the Republican nominee for president, and Ulysses S. Grant takes charge of the Republican Party and the country in 1868. He will serve 2 terms as president until 1876. the centennial anniversary of the United States of America. Okay, I'm going to pause this right now because I have to go do something else. Okay, over the course of the Grant presidency, the intended results of Reconstruction, Lincoln's intended results of Reconstruction, of an end of slavery and welcoming the southern states back into the Union, sort of hit a backlash in that because of our federal system, Democrat politicians are able to seize control once again of the state legislatures of many of the southern states. And then by using state law, which the federal government at this point is unwilling or unable to thwart, by state law, are able to create a segregated society, a two-tiered society with whites at the top and former slave blacks being at the bottom, treated in a completely separate mentality. Now, this was in part because of political maneuvering, but also because of threats of violence. And one of the organizations that comes to prominence at this time is the Ku Klux Klan. This would be a great study for anyone. The life of Nathan Bedford Forrest. I just finished reading a book about him back last year. He eventually, Bedford Forrest eventually recants a lot of his racist views. He was, as a young man, a slave trader. And one of the flamboyant cavalry officers of the Southern cause, and becomes a leader in this lingering antagonism between North and South and how exactly American culture is going to work. Unfortunately, the Klan is responsible for the murdering of well over 1,000 different political enemies, freed people, former slaves. These accounts are very horrendous to recount and try to imagine again. I think it's a necessary truth that people need to come to grips with in the modern era, and to realize that this was just not necessarily singularly a Southern issue. This becomes an issue in big cities in the North. There's a lot of issues that will come up from even the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s, that separate but equal is the law of the land. So even though in the immediate aftermath of the war, Congress passes these enforcement acts, and some of the more brazen acts are going to come to a conclusion. In fact, the terror of the Klan is going to continue to be a major problem moving forward. So just real quickly, we want to go through kind of the second part of the lecture, the Panic of 1873. We mentioned that last week. Some of the social reforms, and eventually how we get back to the era of Jim Crow and basically the very large disappointment of Reconstruction. Okay, so though Grant is easily reelected in 1872, increasingly Northern politicians were growing tired of Southern politics and how the Southern states were running their individual localities. And then, of course, a big hit in the back pocket for many Northern leaders and politicians with the Panic of 1873. I read that, in fact, that this was called the Great Depression before the Great Depression of 1929, the stock market crash. The economy contracted for 65, that's over 5 years of economic decline for the United States of America. So many people began to be more concerned just about their individual local situations, local business, and maybe for many people that war continued to fade further and further into the background, that it was more important to deal with the current situations and the future moving forward than to sort of try to reimagine a new, grander and greater society. So, with the rising growth of cities and the rising influx of immigrants from Europe, Christian entities like the Salvation Army came into being to try to address the needs of the poor, of the sort of the others, young people that had come to the city. The YMCA is another example of that. But there's also groups like the Women's Christian Temperance League, which sees the evils of alcoholism and actually leads toward an amendment to the Constitution later on that is going to try to improve people's lives by addressing some of the vices that plague many people. And of course, there's great evangelists like Dwight L. Moody, give rise to Billy Sunday and then later Billy Graham, who are going to continue to focus on preaching the simple gospel message of Christ, and through this, the restoration not only of a person, their soul, but also an improvement to their life. So these reforms are a big part of this era as well. Not to repeat myself too much, but here we have a slide that's just noting that slowly but surely Democrats regain control of the local or the statewide political houses, especially in the Deep South, Mississippi being a great example. This is going to happen throughout the South, where Louisiana, other places, where eventually the Democrats, who had pretty much run the show prior to the Civil War and had led the disunion or the breaking from the Union, are going to regain control of these states and work adamantly in limiting any rights that the Republicans had brought to the South, and specifically toward any people who had been formerly enslaved. And so while for many slaves, just the mere idea of being free was enough of a balm, there are going to be others that realize that the entire Reconstruction that had been envisioned and the complete enfranchisement of African Americans into the society, American society, had been pretty much stunted and thwarted and had come to a screeching halt. In 1883, the Supreme Court strikes down the Civil Rights Act and tosses that back to the local, to the states, striking at the very heart of this idea of equal protection. Now, the 14th Amendment has increasingly become more of a modern political hot potato that people regarding, gay marriage and all sorts of other issues, equal protection under the law, has become kind of a rallying point. It's a far cry from what was originally intended, that was that those who had been former slaves would be able to participate fully in society. But this is a longer term issue of what's going on with the 14th Amendment. Many of you probably have heard of Jim Crow. That was a name that was simply often referred to a black man generically. He would be referred to as Jim Crow. There was a minstrel show that featured that character. These laws were just basically black codes laws that inhibited people, not just from voting, but where they could live, where they could work, where they could eat out if they, went in those ways. And even researching this in my own hometown up here in the 757, you can identify certain neighborhoods where blacks were permitted to live and whites were permitted, and never shall the two meet. Black beaches, black living areas, and that's sort of a lingering relic of the Jim Crow era, even here up in Virginia Beach. Now, as we close up today, I want you to think about Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a little bit younger than him. But these two guys kind of represent two differing views of Reconstruction. And I'd like to finish the presentation by reading this poem. It goes like this. "It seems to me," said Booker T, "it shows a mighty lot of cheek to study chemistry and Greek when Mr. Charlie needs a hand to hoe the cotton on his land. And when Miss Ann looks for a cook, why stick your nose inside a book?" "I don't agree," said W.E.B. "If I should have the drive to seek knowledge of chemistry or Greek, I'll do it. Charles and Miss can look another place for a hand or cook. Some people rejoice in skill of hand, and some in cultivating land, but there are others who maintain the right to cultivate the brain." "It seems to me," said Booker T, "that all you folks have missed the boat who shout about the right to vote and spend vain days and sleepless nights in uproar over civil rights. Just keep your mouths shut. Do not grouse, but work and save and buy a house." "I don't agree," said W.E.B. "For what can property avail if dignity and justice fail? Unless you help to make the laws, they'll steal your house with trumped up claws. A rope's as tight, a fire is hot, no matter how much cash you've got. Speak soft and try your little plan, but as for me, I'll be a man." "It seems to me," said Booker T. "I don't agree," said W.E.B. I have a little exercise for you to kind of look into that poem a little bit more, to do a little research here during class time today. Who wrote that and your response to it. So I hope that you were able to complete this notes without too much trouble, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys again soon. All the best. Peace out.